Well, thank you, Wes, for the opportunity to address the congregation at this most meaningful time. I must confess to actually having a few nerves. While I've given a few speeches in my time, standing up in front of a congregation like this, wearing a tallis at the bima, sort of brings back a little PTSD from my bar mitzvah. The good news for you and for me is that at least you don't have to hear me sing. So here we are at the end of a very long day, a day of remembrance, contemplation, reflection, and prayer. I suspect each one of us approaches it in our own way. For me, Yom Kippur is very much framed by yizker. And while we recite the yizker service 4 times a year, I think it has special meaning on Yom Kippur. Now, maybe it's because we fast. Maybe it's because we are aware that we all stand in judgment now as the gates are about to close. I think, like all of us during yizker, and this is what yizker is all about, I think of our loved ones who are no longer with us. I think about my parents, my grandparents. I think about Adele's parents. I think about Adele's brother Jack, who died tragically 2 years before Adele and I met. And I also think about our granddaughter Emily, who died 11 years ago today of SIDS. But if I'm honest, and what better day on which to be honest, I actually spend much of my time thinking about my mother, Ruth. And I want to talk to you about her today. I never used to talk about my mother in public, but that all changed actually on a Sunday in December in 2017. And since that day, my mother has almost always been with me, almost as if she's been perched on my shoulder, whispering in my ear. I find myself thinking about her a lot, and for a whole variety of reasons which you're about to hear, talking about her a lot as well. Now, some of you may be familiar with at least a little bit of this story. After stepping down from the presidency of Tufts in 2011, I was enjoying a very comfortable life with Adele. We were spending our winters in Longboat Key near Sarasota, Florida. I was doing a little bit of teaching at Harvard. I was doing some writing. I was serving on some boards. We had started to travel a bit. And I was also serving as a member of the Harvard Corporation, which is the fiduciary body for the university. At the time, the corporation was searching for a new president to succeed Drew Faust. And being a member of the corporation, I was on the search committee. There came a point in the search when my colleagues asked me to step off the committee and actually become a candidate. And it was interesting as I was putting these remarks together, I realized I got the phone call asking me to do that while we were in Jerusalem on a CJP mission. Adele and I thought long and hard about this and spent a lot of time talking about it. Candidly, I was very happy being out of the public eye, happy not to be working 24/7, happy not to have the responsibility of leading a major institution, especially one that has the visibility of a place like Harvard. I was also about to turn 67 at the time, a time when at least many of us are starting to think about dialing back a bit, not plunging in. But at the same time, I knew that the next few years would not be easy for higher education in this country. And the president of Harvard sort of is entrusted with a bit of a bully pulpit on behalf of all of higher education. I thought perhaps I could make a difference, and I actually saw the job as a call to service. So I agreed to be considered. So my first meeting with the committee was actually in New York City on a Sunday at the office of one of our corporation members. Now, we were meeting there to try and avoid the prying eyes of the Harvard Crimson, which was determined to scoop this search. I mean, imagine, Carl Woodward and Woodward and Bernstein running around trying to figure out who was going to be the next president of Harvard. So I recall waiting in the lobby of this office as actually all of my fellow corporation members walked in, and there I was sitting there, and they all sort of waved as they walked into, a big conference room, and they closed the door. And it was the first time I was on the outside, and I sat there, and I sat there, and I waited, said, what is going on? Finally, the door opened. They invited me in to be questioned by the committee. David Rubenstein, who may be familiar to some of you, he's a wonderful interviewer, among other things, asked the first question. I'll never forget it. Larry, he said, you served as president of Tufts for 10 years. The consensus is that you did a great job. You retired with your reputation intact. To this day, you're admired as a very successful college president. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, where is this going? Where is this going? David continued, this is a really tough job during a very difficult time. It's a high-wire act. Success is far from guaranteed. You could crash and burn. Why on earth would you want to take a job like this at this point and put your reputation at risk? It was a great question. And it was one that Adele and I had actually contemplated a bit. And as I was thinking how I was going to answer it, I looked out the window, and this particular conference room was in Lower Manhattan, and it was a tall building, and it looked south over the Battery, over the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island over here, Brooklyn over there. And I found myself saying something along the lines of the following to David. I said, if you look over there, you'll see the Brooklyn Naval Yard. My mother came to this country on the second Liberty ship that brought refugees from Europe after World War II. If you came on a troop ship, which is what Liberty ships were, you arrived not at Ellis Island, but you arrived at the Brooklyn Naval Yard. I explained that my mother had survived Auschwitz. She was the only member of her family, the only member of her town to survive the war. She was 19 years old as she stood with one suitcase, an orphan, on that dock. And I said to David, I feel like I have been fortunate to live the American dream. Where else in the world can you go in one generation from off the boat, literally with nothing, to enjoy the kind of life and opportunity that I have lived? And I said, I'm willing to do this because I want to make sure that future generations have the same opportunity that I had. That's when I started talking about my mother. From that moment on, throughout my tenure as president of Harvard, she was a constant presence who profoundly influenced how it is that I approached and did my job. Let me share with you just a few examples. In the fall of 2019, one of our incoming freshmen, first-year student by the name of Ismail Ajawi, was coming to Harvard actually from Lebanon, where he had been raised in a refugee camp. Now that's a really long journey to go from a refugee camp in Lebanon to come and study at Harvard. Ismail got to Logan Airport and was turned away at the border. Now, the rationale that was given at the time, they asked to see his phone. He's a 19-year-old kid, he gives him his phone. And it turns out Ismail had never said anything negative about the United States, but among his Facebook friends, there was one person who apparently had. And so Ismail was literally put on the same plane and sent back to Lebanon. So I just want you to think about this for a minute. Many of us have dropped kids off at college. You can imagine what a dream it would be to go from where he was to suddenly, to come to Harvard. He had never been out of Lebanon. He had never seen the campus yet. And to be turned away at the border. Crushing, just crushing. When I heard about this, I actually thought about my mother. After she was liberated by the Russians, she actually walked back to her hometown of Lundorf, Germany. It's a distance of about 300 miles from Poland to Lundorf. At the time, there was no infrastructure, so it wasn't as if you could get on a bus or a train. She walked. And she walked back to see if her sister had survived. She knew her parents hadn't, because they had been separated at the platform at Auschwitz. But her sister had been separated from the family much earlier. It turns out she had not. Inga, it turned out, died also at Auschwitz. But my mother at that point was desperate to get out of Germany. She had an aunt and an uncle who had left in '38 from Lundorf and had wound up in Detroit. And she was trying to reach them and trying to get out. And she made her way to the Swiss border, hoping to be able to get out through Switzerland. And like Ismail, she was turned away at the border. So it was at that point that I decided that we were going to do whatever we could to try and get Ismail back into the country. We were going to go to bat for him. And using literally every connection that we had at the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, Harvard alumni who were foreign service officers, we got him another visa, we got him another plane ticket, and 3 days later, he actually arrived back at Logan Airport. This time, they let him through. There had been a to-do in the papers. Some of you may have read about it. And he got there just in time for his class picture to be taken on the steps of Widener Library. And he wound up standing right next to me. It was actually a wonderful moment. In preparing these remarks, I was curious what had happened to Ismail. So I did a little work. Ismail graduated with honors from Harvard and today is studying at Yale Medical School. So later during the pandemic, the president signed an executive order that would have required every foreign student attending a United States university to leave the country if their school was teaching remotely. Now, the rationale for this was if the school's teaching remotely, these foreign students have absolutely no reason to be in the United States. They should go home and study from there. Foreign students were in a panic. In some cases, it was dangerous for them actually to travel at that moment in time. And in other cases, they were going back to places where literally it was impossible for them to study remotely because of lack of high-speed internet access. To leave the country meant that for many of them, their education in the United States would come to an end. Once again, I thought about my mother. I thought how hard she worked to get into this country and what it would have been like for her to be told, because she wasn't a citizen, that now, due to circumstances beyond her control, she had to leave. The next day, Harvard, joined by MIT, sued the federal government to challenge this executive order. When the case was heard by a federal judge in Boston, a week later, once the government was challenged, the government withdrew the order. As a result, 1 million foreign students were allowed to continue their studies in the United States. Ismail, by the way, among them. One final example. During my last year at Harvard, Rabbi Jonah Steinberg, who was the then director of Harvard Hillel, approached me about bringing to campus an exhibition which some of you may have seen in other contexts. It was called Hate Ends Now. It was a cattle car, a replica of the cattle cars that were used to transport Jews to the camps during World War II. And inside of it was a multimedia exhibition which described, the horrors of the Holocaust and what had happened to those who had been deported, as well as the dangers of anti-Semitism more broadly. And Jonah wondered whether or not it would be okay to bring this exhibit to Harvard. I not only supported the project, I said, Jonah, we're going to put this in the middle of the campus. The cattle car was located across from the steps of Widener Library, for those of you who know Harvard, a place where literally every student, faculty member, staff member, and visitor to campus would have to see it while it was sitting there. And not only did I arrange for it to be placed there, but I composed remarks delivered at the opening of the exhibit, and perhaps even more importantly, displayed on a very, very large drop poster. So even people who could not get in to see the exhibit could at least see my remarks. And once again, it was about my mother. And this is what I wrote. For many of you, this cattle car is a reminder of the consequences of hatred and bigotry. For me, it is far more. On September 14th, 1942, my mother, Ruth, was packed into a cattle car like this one with her family and the other Jews from her hometown of Lundorf, Germany. They were being transported to Theresienstadt, a concentration camp in what is now the Czech Republic. Many of them died en route, the living and the dead jammed together. A few years later, my mother spent 2 years in Theresienstadt. A few years later, my mother and her family were packed into another cattle car, this time bound for Auschwitz. Her parents and her sister died there. She was forced to work. She was transported again to a slave labor camp. She survived unspeakable conditions. In early January of 1945, the Russians liberated my mother. She was the only survivor among her family, the only survivor among the people who had been transported from her hometown. And here I should depart from my remarks. My mother came from a small farming village in Germany, but it was part of a group of 7 villages. Think of the villages of Newton. And the collective area was called Rabenau. There were 120 Jews who were deported on that same day from Rabenau. And I said, she was the only survivor among the people that had been transported from her hometown, one of 120. She was 18 years old. She was the same age as our first-year students at Harvard College. I said, for many of you, this cattle car is a reminder of the consequences of hatred and bigotry. For me, it's the family I never met. Now, I suspect I'm not alone today or any other time in hearing the voices of my parents as I go about my life. And I suspect I'm also not alone in trying to please them long after they're gone. There are probably a few psychiatrists or therapists in the audience. Our parents were always trying to please them. God commands us to honor our mothers and fathers. And I think that commandment doesn't end when they're gone. It doesn't end at their death. If anything, we sometimes don't fully appreciate the lessons our parents taught us during their lifetime. It's only after they're gone, sometimes only after we become parents ourselves, that we fully recognize and appreciate their wisdom, their strength, and their resilience. When I became president of Harvard, I never realized how much I would learn about my mother during my tenure. Now, when you're president of Harvard, people send you lots of email. Now, some of these emails are to complain about this or that. Okay. Not that any of you in positions of responsibility ever got emails complaining about anything. Some are people who are just interested in things. Some come from students, some come from faculty, some come from alums. Sometimes they just come from people around the world. And this was a message I received on January 15th, 2022. It was an email from Christina Mueller, a 9th grade teacher in Grünberg, Germany. In preparation for Holocaust Remembrance Day, she gave her students what I thought was a fabulous assignment. What did she ask them to do? She asked them to research the history of the Jewish alumni of their school during the Holocaust. Okay? She made this personal for them. Not just what happened to somebody, what happened to someone who went to their school. This is a 9th grade teacher. So one of those alums that went to the school was someone by the name of Leopold Wertheim. Leopold Wertheim was my grandfather. The students, as they researched what happened to him, learned that he had died at Auschwitz, as did all the other Jewish alumni of the school who were still in Grunberg, or the area. Grunberg was part of Rabenau, who were there on September 14th, 1942, when the 120 Jews of Rabenau were all deported. They learned that he had died there, but that he had had 2 daughters, one of whom had survived, who had eventually made her way to Detroit, who had married, had 2 children, one of whom was pretty easy to find on the internet. So she wrote to me and she asked if I would be willing to record a greeting to her class to be played on Holocaust Remembrance Day, which in Europe is celebrated on January 27th, the date of the liberation of Auschwitz. And I said, of course, I would be happy to. But I also said, but if you prefer, I would be happy to Zoom with your class, okay, so we could have a conversation. And Zoom we did. Over time, these students would teach me a tremendous amount about my mother and her family. My Zoom meeting was covered in the local press. Harvard president Zooms with 9th grade class or something like that, to that effect. And another teacher in a neighboring town by the name of Jens Hausner reached out to me. Now, Jens actually grew up in Lundorf, the same little farming village that my mother grew up, 900 people in Lundorf. He recalled talking to his great-grandmother who told him about how the Nazis had mistreated a Jewish family that lived next door. They routinely beat the man who had lost an arm fighting for Germany in World War I. That man was my grandfather. Jens was outraged that Lundorf had never acknowledged the murder of its Jews. Moreover, those who perpetrated these crimes were never brought to justice. And now I'm going to quote from his email to me because I think it speaks volumes. Quote, "I'm only a private person, and for the moment it's just an idea I have, but I want to break this silence. I want the next generation, those I face every day in my work at school, to know about what happened, to help that anything similar could never happen again. The 14th of September, 2022, is the 80th anniversary of that day when your mother's family and the other Jewish inhabitants of Lundorf were deported." He went on to ask that if he could persuade Lundorf to do something to recognize the Jewish citizens who perished in the Holocaust, would I be willing to attend? The answer was easy. And Adele and I, together with our sons, Jay and Ken, and my sister Lainey, all traveled to Lundorf for what proved to be ultimately a very, very moving ceremony. Prior to the ceremony, the mayor of Lundorf, who was a policeman in a neighboring town, a policeman, spoke incredibly movingly. He asked pointedly, "Why did it take us 80 years to recognize our Jewish neighbors murdered by the Nazis?" His response, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, "Our parents, grandparents, and relatives were complicit in their death. There were Nazis among us. We had to wait until they were gone to finally come to grips, to acknowledge what they had done and the pain that it had caused to so many." Together with others who were descendants of the Jews of Lundorf, there were Jews who, like my mother's aunt and uncle, who had left before the war. Others came back to acknowledge finally what Lundorf was doing. And we helped to dedicate a small park across from where the lone synagogue once stood. The pathway through the park recreated the 3 streets on which all the Jews of Lundorf lived. And along this path, a granite monument now stood with the address of each home in its relative location, with the name of the family, okay, the address of the house, and then the date of the birth and the death of each of the residents of that home. Lundorf had finally acknowledged what had been denied for 80 years. While we were in Lundorf, I had the opportunity to actually meet with young students who had researched my mother's family. I learned from them that my grandfather had been awarded the Iron Cross for valor in the Battle of the Marne, where he had lost his arm, that he was the head of the Jewish community in Lundorf, that he actually sang in the little choir for this synagogue. I think he's the only Bacow that ever had a voice that could carry a tune. He must have been. And I also learned, I saw pictures of my mother and her family that were actually in the museum. Pictures that I had never seen before. We had almost no photographs of my mother as a child, photographs of her family. They had all been lost in the war. I also learned that before my mother was deported on that cattle car, that she gave her prized dollhouse to the little girl next door that she used to play with, which was the great-grandmother of Jens Hausner. While we were there, Adele and I met a remarkable young man by the name of Luke Schaff. Now, Luke was one of the students who was assigned to research my grandfather's history. Okay, each group of students was assigned a different Jewish alum. And my mother was a year older than Luke was. She was 15 at the time that she was deported. And I think in part because Luke was so close in age to my mother that he took a great interest in her story. He spent the last 2 years gathering more information about my mother, researching her history and that of her family and that of the Jews of Lundorf. He's created a website actually devoted to my mother and her story. He's written a book about my mother, and he's given talks all over Germany about what happened to the Jews of Lundorf and specifically to my mother. He wants to be sure that his generation learns from this dark chapter in Germany's history. Moreover, he continues to speak out courageously, even when confronted with threats from those who would prefer that Germany's past remain buried. If you ever wonder whether or not one person can make a difference, if you ever wonder whether or not any of you can make a difference, I encourage you to reflect a bit about the work of Christina Mueller, Jens Hausner, the mayor of Lundorf, and Luke Schaff, 2 public school teachers, a policeman, and a teenager in rural Germany. None of them are Jewish, yet each is determined to ensure that future generations both understand and confront Germany's sad history, as well as the evils of anti-Semitism. They're doing this at a time in which anti-Semitism is on the rise in Germany. It's on the rise throughout Europe. Sadly, it's on the rise in the United States as well. As Wes reminded us, just look at what happened in Manchester today. If these 3 people, if they can find the strength to respond, again, 2 public school teachers, a policeman, and a teenager, if they can do this, if they can find the strength to speak out, I think we can also stand up and be counted so that And I think at a time in which hope is in short supply, the actions of these individuals actually give me hope. We can learn a lot from each of them. This past January, President Alan Garber asked if Adele and I would represent Harvard at a ceremony commemorating the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Now, I have to confess, given my mother's history, I had avoided visiting any of the death camps in the past. I just thought it might be too painful. But now I felt I could not say no. The ceremony would be held on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, January 27th, which also happened to be my mother's yahrzeit. Yes, my mother, a survivor of Auschwitz, died on the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, years later, but the same date, January 27th. Many of you have been to Auschwitz-Birkenau. I won't try to describe it. As I stood on the same platform where my mother was separated from her parents, the crematoria is still visible, I marveled and thought of her strength, her resilience. By the time she was liberated by the Russians, she had lost everyone and everything that mattered to her. Her family, her friends, her home, her childhood, her community, everything. She was just 18 years old at that point. Yet she managed to live a life without bitterness. She was optimistic, fun, forward-looking, down-to-earth, and not the least bit neurotic. Lainey and I, my sister and I, enjoyed an incredibly normal childhood. Somehow my mother managed to avoid passing on the generational trauma which so many children of survivors are burdened with. I once asked her, "Mom, how is this possible? How could she not let this horrific experience define her?" Her answer, it was a conscious choice. She said up to that point in her life, Hitler had taken away from her everything that she loved, everything that she cared about, every person, gone. She said, if I had remained angry and bitter, he would have destroyed the rest of my life. I decided that living well would be my revenge, and living well is what she did. She said she could never forgive or forget, but living well would be her revenge. This is not an easy time to be a citizen. It's not an easy time to be a Jew. As a nation, we are deeply divided. As Jews, we're deeply divided. Families are deeply divided. At times, this congregation is also deeply divided. But like my mother, we can also make choices. Let us, as the gates are closing before us, let us choose to model the behavior that we would hope to see in the rest of the world. Let us try to be quick to understand and slow to judge. Let us reach out to those who think differently from us, not to persuade, but to comprehend. Let us be inspired by my mother's resilience. She chose optimism over despair, kindness over anger. Through the darkest of times, she embraced life and lived it well. She became a light to all who knew her. I believe if we put our minds to it, each of us can do the same. Gemar Hatima Tova.
Larry, thank you. Can you tell us what it was like growing up in your home with your mother and your father? We'll get to your dad in a minute, but what was it like growing up in your home? Did they talk about the Holocaust? Did she talk about Auschwitz? Did she talk about it, or how did you know about it?
So I can never remember not knowing about it. I knew that my mother had lost her family. I knew she had been in Auschwitz. I knew I knew the story. But growing up, if we were watching TV and there was something that came on the whole, if there was something that came on the TV, my mother would either leave the room or we'd change the channel. All right. So I was aware of it, but it wasn't talked about. That all changed. Let's see. It was not long after we met Adele. My mother had a heart attack. And I think she realized at that point her own vulnerability. And that's when she started talking about things in some detail. And that's when we really learned about it. But it was, again, my mother, my friends liked to play at my house because they all loved to be around my mother. She was also a great baker. They loved her cookies. I grew up in a home without a store-bought cookie. So it was a happy home. It was, sort of Leave It to Beaver-like in some ways, notwithstanding this trauma that was sort of sitting there.
Wow. And Larry, you're talking about lessons we get from our parents, and your mother is obviously just unique and beautiful and powerful and poignant in all the ways you've described. I mean, who can even, there aren't words. But you began your remarks by talking about yizker, and we remember our loved ones. Not everyone is blessed to have a mother that they love. Plenty of people have parents where there's much more texture, much more ambivalence. What do you say to somebody who on yizker doesn't get to think about somebody like your mother, but has a much more nuanced, complicated relationship?
Well, there's a wonderful prayer that's on the left side of the machzor for yizker, for those who, in fact, cannot remember their parents as fondly as many of us are fortunate enough to remember ours. So I think, look, there are no perfect parents in the world, and I don't mean to suggest that my mother or father didn't make mistakes. Certainly Adele and I have made our shares of mistakes. Our kids remind us of those all the time. But I think there are lessons there too. I mean, sometimes we have some good friends. When we became grandparents, they said to us, your kids are going to give you a grade on how they think you've done as a parent. I said, really? I said, yeah, just watch what they replicate in terms of how you raised them and watch what they run from. And so I think that, there are lessons from our parents even when we've had challenging, difficult relationships with our parents, that we can learn from that and try not to pass down, l'ador v'ador, the mistakes, the traumas from one generation to another. My mother managed to avoid, again, passing on to us brilliantly. So,
Larry, your talk is entitled Lessons from Our Parents, but the lion's share of all the energy in your beautiful words was about your mom. Could you say something about your father?
So my dad also came to this country as a refugee. My father was born in Minsk in 1915. He came to this country in 1920. They came to avoid the pogroms at the time in Eastern Europe. My father always said his oldest memory was hiding in a ditch, actually, when the Cossacks came through their little town, torching the homes of Jews. My father was the eldest of 4 kids. His father was a carpenter in Germany, a cabinet maker, actually. Couldn't get a job doing that, so he was a rough carpenter. He got work that way in the States. Ultimately became a builder. Both my parents grew up in Orthodox homes. My grandfather was proud of the fact that he built 4 shuls in Detroit. If you wanted to build a shul in Detroit, you came to my grandfather because he would not charge any fee for being the contractor for that. My dad was an extremely principled person. We joked in the family that he lacked the tact gene. He always said what was on his mind. He put himself through college and law school at night, became a small-town lawyer. I'll tell you one story about my father, which I think says everything about him. And that is, I grew up in Pontiac, Michigan. Pontiac had a very small Jewish community, about 150 families. My sister Lainey, who's 2 years older than I am, was very, very popular in school. I was the nerdy little brother. But Lainey was extremely popular. In 10th grade, which was the first year of high school in Pontiac, there was a sorority and a fraternity which was sponsored by the school. They had advisors. And Lainey was crushed when she was not invited to join. And then my father did a little research and realized that no Jewish girl and no black girl had ever been invited to join this sorority. So my father went to the school committee, okay, and at a public meeting stood up, explained the facts, and said to the school committee, "You're either going to change this or I'm going to sue you." And so they changed it. They disbanded the sorority. My sister was mortified, by the way, okay, because now all of her friends who were in no longer had a, but my father, my father was very principled and fearless when it came to addressing what he thought was injustice. So.
Larry, could you talk about your own Jewish identity, especially when you were president of Harvard, how you thought about your Jewish identity at Harvard and how it manifested when you were at Harvard?
So no different, I would say, than when I was at Tufts. We are who we are. Being Jewish is, it's not only very important to me, it's who I am, and I love being Jewish. We keep a kosher home. So, when we got to Tufts and we got to Harvard, I think we had, Adele, probably the only kosher president's house in the history of the Ivy League. We had a Hanukkah Habayat in which we invited a number of our friends from the temple. A number of you were there for it. We hung mezuzot literally on every door at Elmwood. There are a lot of doors at Elmwood, but they all had mezuzot. I made a point of attending services, both at Tufts and at Harvard. You would see us on the second day of Rosh Hashanah here, because we always went to the first day of Rosh Hashanah at Hillel, both at Tufts and at Harvard. We would do Kol Nidre at Tufts or Harvard, because it was tough to get across in time to get here. But then we would be here for Yom Kippur. At both places, I always had aliyahs. Whenever we would, be in shul there. So it was, I tried to be visible as a Jew. For those of you who weren't there, and that's the vast majority of you, at my inauguration, I asked Wes to give the benediction. And he gave it, I felt like a bar mitzvah boy, because he walked over. I thought he'd go to the podium and just do the normal benediction. No, Wes walked over to where I was sitting. He asked me to stand. He put his hands on my shoulders. Yevarechecha Adonai. And by the way, I also talked about my parents at my inauguration. So I wanted people to know that I was Jewish. I wanted our Jewish students to feel like, I was one of them. So it's, and I tried to invoke my parents' story and, and my mother's name in some cases explicitly, as I explained there. I was interviewed on All Things Considered by Mary Louise Kelly after Ismail Ajawi got back, and she asked, why did I do this? And I told the exact same story I told here.
So Larry, this is a time of deep anxiety for the Jewish people, really everywhere. You mentioned Manchester, but every day, every way, deep anxiety, worries abound. And for me, what concretizes this is an article that Franklin Foer wrote in The Atlantic in March of 24 with a very sticky title, "The Golden Age of American Jews is Ending." The golden age of American Jews is ending. And I'm curious to know your thoughts. Do you agree with that, do you think that the golden age of American Jews is ending?
No.
Great.
Next question.
Yeah. Great.
No,
I'm happy to hear that, but could you say a bit more?
yeah. No, I don't think it's ending. Look, the history of our people is the history of suffering. We've seen this movie before. We've seen it, for thousands of years. And I'd like to think, like my mother, we are a resilient people, and we will come back. But I also think that we as Jews continue to enjoy, notwithstanding the rise of anti-Semitism. Look, anti-Semitism, one of the things, I want to make this clear, and I say this now as a former college president. For those of you who think that it's within the power of college presidents to end anti-Semitism on college campuses, it's not going to happen. There's no leader in the last 3,000 years anywhere who stamped out anti-Semitism completely. All right? We need to confront it. We need to push back against it. It's one of the reasons why I did what I did and was as visible on these issues as I was during my time at Harvard. But I think, the history of the world is that it rises and it falls. And I think I still believe in the goodness of the American people. I still believe in the American dream. I think we all have to work to preserve that. We can't take it for granted. I still believe that Jews will continue to enjoy opportunity and flourish. I believe that the teachings of our faith are too important to keep to ourselves, which is one of the reasons why every time I gave a major speech at Harvard, I tried to include a reference to Talmud or Torah. Especially right now when we are so challenged given what's going on in the Middle East and how the younger generation views Israel. And by the way, when I say the younger generation views Israel, I'm talking about how the Jewish younger generation views Israel. I mean, we need to worry about that. But I still believe that much of what we stand for, the concept of tikkun olam, for example, just resonates so well with this generation, and we need to keep teaching what the tenets are of our religion. We need to keep teaching the ethics of our fathers at a time in which ethics has never been more important. And I continue to believe that if we do, we will continue to flourish, and we will succeed in sort of pushing back again on this scourge of anti-Semitism.
Larry, it's very reassuring to me to hear what you say, that you don't think the golden age is ending. I'm curious about, it's Yom Kippur and soon the Elah and soon the gates close. Let's talk about agency. What can all of us who are gathered here in the Rabbi Chill Sanctuary do to, depending on your point of view, either restore the golden age if you think it's gone, or to strengthen the golden age if you think it's not gone? But what can each of us do? In other words, like the golden age of American Jewry is ending is a tough title because it makes us a spectator to a spectator sport. It's
Exactly.
ending, it's not ending. And I don't like that. I like being participants, not spectators. So we have a role in shaping the golden age, whether it's still here or not here, or it's wavering. What is it? How do we exercise our agency to strengthen the Jewish story in this country?
Well, I think we have to keep telling our stories. I look out at this congregation, and I suspect every single one of us knows the story of our ancestors who struggled to come to this country, right? Everybody, right? We all know. Those are stories that need to be told. They not only need to be told, but they need to be told in a way so that people can see themselves in those stories. That, I believe we have an obligation to others who are struggling. I think historically, we've reached out, we've tried to create opportunity for others in a variety of ways. We have to continue to do that. I think that we need to continue to lead in the fields in which we've traditionally led, whether or not it's the arts, it's culture, it's the sciences, it's the professions. And I think we need to do it as proud Jews. I don't think this is not a time to hide the fact that you're Jewish. This is a time to actually be proud of it and sort of say, look, we are here, Hinene, here I am.
So, Larry, let me ask, since it's Yom Kippur and since it's almost Ne'ilah, I'd love to get an honest answer looking at your heart and soul on the following crucial question. You and Adele are blessed with 4 grandchildren, Adam and Ruby, and Bridget and Ruthie, of course, named for Ruth.
As is Ruby.
As is Ruby. Wow, beautiful. And here's my question, your honest answer, your honest heart, your honest soul. How do you feel about the world that your grandchildren are going to be inheriting?
Well, look, I think we all worry about the world that our grandchildren will be inheriting. But again, here we have agency. I mean, we can either sort of say to our grandchildren, sorry, we blew it, this is what we're leaving you, or we can try and work to ensure that we leave them a world where they can flourish just as we can. That requires allies. It's not just up to us. But look, one of the things which I take from my mother, I tried to express it, is the importance of optimism. I also have to tell you that, one of the challenges of being a leader is that you cannot lead unless you can persuade people that the future actually is going to be better than the present. Because the proposition of follow me because we're heading down is not necessarily a winning proposition, right? So, but I don't have all the answers. I never claim to. But I think that, when I look at historically what we have done in so many different fields, how we have helped to build a culture, helped to build a nation, the nation that we are in now, but also build, the nation of Israel. We have to keep working at it. And the work is never done. It is never done. If you think that someday you're going to wake up and we've checked the box and we can now all relax, well, that's not reality. It's not reality as citizens of the United States. I mean, George Washington talked about the experiment of democracy. This requires our work, and we have to keep working at it. And I think as Jews, we have to keep working to ensure that there's a strong Jewish community. Yes, am I concerned? Absolutely, I'm concerned. But am I willing to sort of write it off and sort of say the golden age is over? Sorry, we tried, it didn't work. Here, now it's your problem? No, I think, I continue to believe we are capable of doing great things as a nation. We've been divided before as a nation. All you have to do is take a look at the 60s, the 1860s, and the 1960s. We came back together after both of those. Admittedly, we fought a bloody civil war. But the point is that I think we can do better. And if we just focus on the short term, I think we'll all get so discouraged that we won't even try. We need to take the long view. We have to keep plugging away. We have to also be the kinds of people that we hope to see in others. Again, we want to model the behavior we would hope to see in the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. Last question. The themes, like if I'm thinking about your gorgeous, gorgeous words, the themes of your gorgeous words to me are two takeaways. One is the power of optimism embodied by your mother. And the other is the power of an individual to make a difference. In your narrative, your mother made a difference, 1 out of 120, and she created this beautiful world for you and Lainey and for her grandchildren and for her great-grandchildren. And then there are all the actors that you mentioned in Germany, the policeman and the mayor and the high school, the 9th grade teacher and the 15-year-old. And an individual can change the trajectory. That's a very powerful idea because we're all individuals. That means we could all change the trajectory. And it's about relationships. And I just want to close, if you could share with the congregation the time that this Luke, this 15-year-old who learned so much about your mother, you and Adele invited him to come to America, to New York, to Boston. Could you tell us about the time that Luke, this 15-year-old from rural Germany who took an interest in your mother, came to Newton?
Oh, we had a great time with Luke. First, Lainey, my sister and brother-in-law and I, we wanted to thank Luke. So Luke had never been out of Germany. So we bought him a ticket and we brought him over here last summer. And he started in Philadelphia. He stayed with my niece, Lainey's daughter. She took him to a Phillies game. All right. Luke comes from a town where literally, how many seats are in the shul, by the way? How do we see?
As Rabbi Chill used to say, it sleeps 700.
Okay.
I think our shul sleeps 700.
You could put all of Luke's town in the sanctuary and have space for 200 more. So for Luke to see, it was his first professional sporting event. It was a night game, so it's, very bright. He was just blown away. She showed him the historic sites of Philadelphia. Then he came to New York. We met him in New York. We took him to the Statue of Liberty. We took him to Central Park. We took him to a Broadway play. He'd never seen a play before, other than a school play. It was magnificent seeing our country through his eyes. And it was an incredible privilege and a treat for us to be able to show him the country that my mother had come to after she grew up next door to where he had come from. And we're very much in touch with Luke. I just talked to him about a week and a half ago. And he's got an academic publisher for his book now, which is really impressive. If I would tell all of you, if you could buy futures in Luke Schaff, do it today. This kid's going to go far.
So, Larry, let me just close by saying that I can't imagine a more important or inspiring message before the Ne'ilah, before we're facing the closing gates. The takeaways that I got from your story are the power of optimism, and that optimism is not just a feeling, it's a set of deeds. The power of individuals to make a difference, and the importance of agency. And despite all that your mother went through, there was no moaning and groaning, there was no lamenting. It was all energy, energy, energy. It was all action. It was all agency in service of a better future, which she created. May we all learn from your mother and from all of our loved ones to do the same. Thank you so much, Larry.
Amen.